I just want to talk about a memory that I've got of Ableton Live. And I remember when I saw it for the first time, it was just something that was almost like it was from another planet. You know, I was used to Cubase, which was very much a kind of linear time thing. So you go from kind of the beginning of the end to the track. Same with Logic as well, you know, just this idea of, in a way, building up a composition, kind of start, finish. And of course, sometimes we'd start composing something in the middle and we'd kind of flesh stuff out either side. You know, that kind of thing definitely happened. But I remember when I saw the session view, particularly, it was I think that was kind of like the natural first screen that you see of Ableton Live. And it totally phased me. I was like, what on earth is this that I'm looking at? And I remember, you know, this whole idea of trying to break my mind free from the left to the right. You know, here we had kind of top to bottom, you know, the idea of these individual clips, which was really weird. You know, a little block that I'd click, that I'd trigger. And in those days when it first came out, I didn't have any hardware that would work with it naturally. So it definitely was a case of clicking and doing so. This is before Push and before the Launchpad and so on, these other devices that have come along. And then the idea of the scenes, and I was like, a scene, okay, it's a row of clips that I can trigger. And it took a long time for me to get used to it. And I thought, yeah, this is interesting. But I definitely struggled with it for a period of time. You know, I remember, I guess maybe it was a year or two, I think even. And I really had to persevere and get myself past the left to right thing. And that, I think, is really interesting to think about it. You know, for me as someone, a producer that was using kind of linear DAWs from the 90s is kind of this new concept. And of course, there were platforms that have done similar on a hardware level before. So it wasn't anything particularly new, but it was the presentation, the method of that. And then dealing with things like being able to, within the clip, select a specific kind of smaller loop, then behaviors, you know, from clip to clip. And it was just like another world. So it definitely took me a couple of years to get into it. And I think really the thing that I guess kind of pushed it to the next level was, you know, I guess the point blank stuff. And having to, you know, I've got, you know, a class with Cubase users, Logic users, and Ableton Live users. And so it was a case of having to understand it in order to be able to teach it. So I was forced to learn it. And that's when I started to understand kind of the things that I started to really enjoy about it. And then, of course, you know, hardware devices connecting to it, things like Launchpads and Push, that's where it all really started to make a lot more sense. And I think, you know, the thing about Ableton Live is that kind of performance, the freestyle, the session aspect, I think is a very, very powerful aspect still. And I don't always use it in that way. You know, my Push 2 is just really old now. It's in a mess. It's not responsive, so I'm not using it anymore. If I did have the most recent Push, I think, yes, absolutely, I'd be integrating with it more. And what's interesting is actually the MPC that I've got, the One Plus, does actually do a very, very good wireless remote control of Ableton Live. It works incredibly well, but it's just a touch screen is not the same as pushing buttons. You know, I'm much more interested in, you know, I get more out of it if I'm kind of pushing something physically, you know. So I prefer buttons really more so than a touch screen. So yeah, that would be something. It'd be great to get hold of one of those new pushes. But yeah, the integration, I think the key, if anyone asks me, what are you using at the moment? And I've used, you know, pretty much all of the DAWs. I have an affinity for some. You know, from kind of historic reasons. And of course, the feature sets have really advanced over the years and some great updates, you know, across all of them. But I do find myself coming back time and time again to Ableton Live. And, you know, I think there's a simplicity there that in a way, the way it's arranged, the screen, I mean, when I first saw it, I hated it. It was, you know, you might have heard of the term skeuomorphism, and that's where a user interface on a piece of software will be realistic looking. And Ableton Live was not realistic looking. If you're looking at a compressor, it didn't look like a piece of hardware. Yet a plugin could be skeuomorphic and it would have realistic looking components, looking like a piece of hardware represented as a user interface. So I really struggle with that as well. You know, this kind of simplistic, minimal, flat version of stuff But now I think that's one of the things I actually do quite like about it. It becomes kind of anonymized. Yes, it may have a personality, but it's just pushed to the background in a way that you use something for a specific reason. And Ableton Live does have some great, great effects built in. But the old version of me would prefer the skeuomorphic and having almost like a rack of hardware like I used to have. So it's an interesting one. It's a contrast. It's an internal kind of juxtaposition in a way. But, long story short, Ableton Live, I think these days is my most preferred platform for lots of different reasons. I do like the session view and I've used it a lot, but I do think it's much better suited to hardware. So if you're pushing buttons, triggering scenes, all that kind of stuff, it feels really freestyle. I really like it. But equally, if you're still doing just the left to right thing, arranging stuff on a timeline, I think it's a great, very powerful way of doing things. And one of the things that I felt was quite interesting for me recently, there was a song that I put together on Logic, and it had plenty of automation going on. I found it harder to deal with lots of automation on Logic compared to Ableton Live. And I thought that was quite an interesting experience, so much so that I took everything that was in Logic and I just started again. I took all the elements and brought them through into Ableton Live, and I felt more comfortable with it. And it could be down to the fact that I hadn't used Logic as much as Live in recent times. For me, if I'm using something regularly and sitting with it, then that's what feels comfortable. So when I move away, or there's always going to be this kind of need to get back and feel comfy again, with a DAW if you haven't been on it for a while. Same with Cubase. I use Cubase for every single track on the Night Tales 3 album. And that was a really interesting exercise because at the very beginning I had to get comfortable again with the platform. And it's always the way. You use something repetitively, you will be comfortable with it. So that's the interesting thing. But, Ableton Live, I do think if people are always asking me what's my favorite, and ultimately, sorry everybody else, I do think that Ableton Live is my preferred DAW and has really been for a number of years.